Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel. My name is Grinning Zero, and we are here to review what is one of my top RPGs of all time. Yes, I am serious when I say this game is fantastic, and yes, I recommend you play it. Is this game perfect? No. There is no such thing as a perfect game after all. Anyways, Adam RPG, where do we begin? There is a lot to like about this game. There are a couple things I don't like, of course, but I do believe that the good far outweighs the bad. In fact, the Adam team has really outdone themselves, and I get it. This is a 3-year-old game. Why are we reviewing something that's 3 years old? Because this title deserves more exposure than what it has had. While it's not genre-defining by any means, we have a well-crafted, enjoyable title that we can easily sink dozens of hours into that I think is better than many full-price AAA games coming out today. So with that said, let's talk about it. Let's start with what Adam RPG gets right. From the moment we set foot in the post-apocalyptic Soviet Union all the way to the ending scenes, we are constantly shown just how much love and care has been put into this game. Upon starting a new playthrough, we are immediately sucked into this world that is dark, gloomy, and devoid of life and color. You might be thinking that being devoid of life and color in a game is not a good thing, but here it's real good. Why? It adds to the atmosphere. Sure, the 3D visuals aren't the prettiest, after all they aren't winning any awards for detail nor graphical fidelity, but for what it is though, and that's the overall look and feel of the game. That look being a harsh, devastated world that has undergone a literal trial by fire via nuclear apocalypse. And as for the artwork, hats off to the artists for this game. Every loading screen, every character profile, down to the old school menu style is beautiful. And the sound design, while simple, is also great. Gunshots have weight to them, environmental sound effects give each unique area its own personality, and even the overall soundtrack adds a sense of foreboding that I think is a major plus here. On the subject of unique areas, the game is littered with both major and minor that all have a story to tell, whether obvious at first or not. And sometimes we walk into an area that has absolutely nothing going on, only to later return to deal with the various situations through quests that we obtain throughout our playthrough. Now, many of these areas have a distinct personality that also sets them apart, so we never feel as if we're exploring or interacting with a cut-and-paste world. And they're reached via a classic old-school RPG staple. Think Fallout 1 and 2, where we zoom out on our character and select where we want to go. Now, from there, our character begins a slow death march to their destination, unless, of course, we acquire a vehicle, which, let me tell you, becomes an absolute lifesaver to the overall pacing. And during our march to the next location, we end up coming across numerous dynamic encounters, either with hostile or friendly NPCs, that really enhances the feeling that you are in a living, breathing wasteland. It's a nice touch, and it absolutely adds enjoyability to the game. Now, if there's one thing this game does right by the player, it's giving us good characters to interact with. The characters themselves are often interesting and almost always have something to say, from the sinister to outrageous, lucrative jobs to complete, and even high to low quality items to trade for. Unless your character was like mine during my initial playthrough, in which case we're really good at punching things, but not so much at talking to people. When we do successfully interact with other characters, many of them often contain unique dialogue options that allow our character to grow in experience or to obtain quests that might otherwise be locked behind skill checks. Now, pro tip here, invest in speechcraft, seriously. It makes a world of difference and creates a much more enjoyable experience. Now let's talk about quests. Quests are usually interesting and add value to our character story, with most quests being unique but well crafted without sticking to the fetch quest formula that we see in a lot of modern RPGs. Each time we complete a quest, we are in fact growing our impact on our story's ending, giving us as the player an incentive to complete those quests. Do many of these quests actually feel meaningful by the end credits? Well, not all of them, but many of them do, and we are treated to an ending based on the outcome of many of these quests we have completed that provides a sense of closure from our many adventures in this Soviet hellscape. So I won't spoil the exact outcomes we see, but do keep in mind the kind of effects that many of these quests have determine the fate of not only characters, but also entire towns and even the entire region. This adds an incentive to replay the game and experiment with the different outcomes in each quest, which By the way, the replayability of this game is awesome. This is one thing that Adam RPG should be applauded for. It feels like few games these days have the kind of value we get here. But with Adam RPG, there is so much content in this game, bordering at times on too much content, that you can easily spend dozens, if not hundreds of hours of playtime within the game. For a game that on average only costs $15, this is absolutely incredible. And despite the flaws, as I said, should be applauded. For the most part, we get high quality, replayable content that oftentimes doesn't feel like it's low quality or cut and paste. Now, what helps promote this replayability further is the writing. The writing overall is good, and in some ways outdoes much larger titles and franchises. In other words, we never feel as if the story itself is inconsistent or poorly told, but rather we feel a sense of mystery and wonder about what will happen to our character on our playthrough next. This is apparent all the way down to the notes and journals we find in the game that make us wonder what happened to a particular character or area in the past. Now, don't get me wrong here, the writing isn't perfect. There are some grammar and spelling errors here and there that do cause some issues, but I found this to be rare. By the way, if you don't like reading at all, I will tell you that this game is probably not for you. There is a lot of reading, but on the other hand, even if you aren't the biggest fan of reading, seriously, give this game a shot. You might in fact like what's here, especially for the choices that we as the player are given as a result, which is the big cheese of this game. What do I mean by this? We are spoiled for choice, to the point where making decisions can sometimes be difficult. There are actual consequences to many of the choices that you make in this game, and you visually see them happen more often than not. For example, do we show our strength to a gate guard and try to act tough only to anger them and start a fight? Or do we smooth talk our way into that same compound they are guarding? Or just walk away and come back later, guns blazing like we're the A-team? This is just one example of the myriad of choices that we have, and I don't feel like a lot of RPGs these days get that right or do it as well as Adam does. And I think the game does a great job of handling these various choices we come across. It is a fantastic touch, and honestly one of the most memorable parts of this game, especially given the impact our choices can have later, making our lives either easier, more difficult, or just plain more interesting. To top all of this off, skills matter, and it ties into everything else I said earlier. I cannot stress this enough. How we build our character plays heavily into how easy or hard this game is. There are full-priced AAA RPGs out right now that fail to capture what Adam RPG does here, where not having high enough skill points in technology, for example, means we can't even use a cassette player, or specializing in the wrong skills can lead to a frustratingly punishing playthrough where enemy NPCs bulldoze us at every corner. It's the cherry on top that I think makes this game special, and I really can't remember the last time we had a game that had such an emphasis on character skills to this extent. Now, we have talked about what Adam RPG does right, but what does it not do right? What is not so good about this game? Well, there's two things here. First is the combat. It is the first thing I will tell you I am not personally a fan of. I do like turn-based combat to a certain extent. However, here it's not as good as it could be, which mainly comes down to interactivity and a certain element of clunkiness. Combat here is executed in a chess-like manner. We have action points, and we use those points to execute attacks, movement, and item usage, along with attacks being based on a percentage which is reflective of skill, attribute, distance, and time of day. It's simple, it allows for a good amount of strategic thinking, and it does get the job done. After all, sometimes that is really all that you need. But when the difficulty can wildly vary between incredibly easy to borderline unfair in Adam RPG, the combat system can feel frustrating to work with at times, which is honestly because of how simple it is. I would have liked to have seen something more interactive and in-depth like the combat from XCOM 2, which I really enjoy. Now, I'd also like to mention that cover and terrain are both present and they are useful to a certain extent. But more often than not, there is a lack of verticality in battles, and there is also not a true cover system. Our character won't change their stance to, for example, kneel behind sandbags or cars or be behind a brick wall to reflect the cover we are attempting to use. So essentially, we are either behind what the game considers a solid object completely shielding us, or we aren't, and we take bullets to the face. Additionally, the AI is fairly simplistic in combat. While I have seen the AI attempt to use tactics such as breaking line of sight, retreating, or closing the distance towards us and our companions, fights essentially play out the same way. That is, we encounter enemies, we exchange bullets to the chest, win the fight, or die to the inherent randomness in the game before doing the same loop over and over again, which can become repetitive towards the second half of the game. With all of that said, I don't think combat is the center point here, but I do believe that improvements could be made to make for more interesting dynamic situations and outcomes when it comes to the combat, such as increased variation in terrain, a decent cover system, and just general improvements to the AI. Now, the second thing I think this game doesn't do as well as it could is the pacing. It's not the greatest. At one point, it feels like we are zooming across the wasteland, only to suddenly slam on the brakes. Effectively, the game slows down to a crawl with large amounts of backtracking and can turn into a grind of repetitive dynamic encounters that end up with us eye-rolling at times because we're encountering the same pack of wolves or the Doomsday Cult yet again. I did say that this game does border on too much content, and I think this is where this somewhat comes into play. I think that really the way to improve this is to just scale back a little bit, tighten things down a little bit more, and I really do think that would do wonders for the mid to late game content and improve the overall pacing of the game. So that's the good and the not so good, but what about everything else? Now, I'm certain I've missed quite a few things, but these are more or less the more important ones that I would like to mention. So up to this point, I haven't really mentioned the story. There is a main quest, sure, as that quest is the end goal of the game, but it's really just there as something to do like most RPGs. It is written fairly well, and it does get the job done. Anyways, I'm not going to spoil it for you, so that's as much as I'm going to say on it. What I will speak on, though, is performance, of which up to this point, again, haven't really talked about it. Overall performance has been pretty good, minus a couple of bugs here and there, such as the minimap and random encounters just opening without input, and a strange sound issue in forested areas where the wind would blow and the audio itself would cut in and out. Other than that, the game mostly ran just fine, though there was somewhat of a delay with certain actions that I started noticing, particularly from the mid to the late game. Anyways, the last thing we're going to cover here as part of one of the more important areas I haven't mentioned is the difficulty. Now, I didn't put this as good or bad for a reason. I wouldn't say the game is particularly hard, but it's also not easy. It does strike a certain middle ground. At times, the difficulty felt fair and consistent, then at other times, it felt wildly challenging to the point of being unfair and impossible. Now, it's difficult for me to gauge exactly where I stand on this, as I rather like the uncertainty and challenge that the game does offer, but also despise the moments where we are thrown into situations where we have to start save scumming. Now, for someone who has never played this style of RPG, or played this game, let me go ahead and just tell you that this is heavily build dependent. So I would highly recommend taking your time and choosing a balanced build before going into the game and then getting extremely frustrated with how your playthrough goes. Anyways, I played on normal and found that my most enjoyable playthrough was with a character that had high dexterity, intelligence, and a focus on speechcraft and automatic weapons, which honestly felt kind of overpowered towards the end of the game, especially with companions. Despite the flaws, I think this game is fantastic. It's a game that I want to play more of, and one that I do recommend trying out when you get the chance. The sheer amount of choice, the awesome post-apocalyptic atmosphere, the solid writing, and the fact we have what feels like a true successor to Fallouts 1 and 2 really speaks for itself. The Adam team has absolutely created something special here, and I look forward to seeing what's in store for the Adam RPG franchise, especially considering that a standalone expansion that looks pretty promising dropped just a few months ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, feel free to click that like button. If not, click the dislike button, even though it's just sort of there. And with that said, this is Grinning Zero, signing off.